Tonight on Primetime Politics, pointing the finger of blame.
They would rather grind Parliament to a halt than hand over documents related to the scandal to the RCMP.
Conservatives are pushing back on the call to end a parliamentary standoff, saying the Commons deserves full access to documents related to a collapsed Green Fund. Coming up, we'll get reaction from the government House Leader Karina Gould. Also,
we can surely push Russia towards a just peace.
Vladimir Putin lowers the threshold for a nuclear strike, responding to U.S. missiles that Ukraine is now free to use on targets in Russia. What does this mean for a wider European conflict? We will speak with security analyst Christian Leuprecht. And on track for a second progressive Conservative majority, we'll speak to polls analyst Éric Grenier about the Nova Scotia campaign with just 1 week left before the provincial vote. This is Primetime Politics. Hello everyone, I'm Michael Serapio. There's still no end in sight to that procedural standoff that has grounded the House of Commons for 8 weeks now. The standoff triggered by a Conservative motion introduced in September, but the Conservative House Leader refuses to take blame for lost sitting days. Instead, he blames the Trudeau Liberals for refusing to hand over documents tied to a now defunct Green Fund. The Conservatives want the RCMP to review those documents for any criminal wrongdoing.
And let's remember what this scandal is all about. Liberal-friendly board members, people appointed to the board by Justin Trudeau, funneled tax dollars into their own companies. The Auditor General found $400 million worth of grants misappropriated in this way. Also found over 180 conflicts of interest. And the government has fought transparency on this all along the way.
Now, yesterday, the government House Leader did share that her government has already given 29,000 pages related to the fund to Parliament, but because many of those pages are redacted or withheld, Mr. Scheer says it amounts to nothing more than a stunt. For her reaction to this, we're now joined by the government House Leader Karina Gould. Minister, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, Mr. Scheer says your government is not being transparent about the Green Fund, that your lack of transparency points to Liberal misuse of public funds. What do you say to that?
Well, he's making it all up. He's just not telling the truth. The fact that he's even suggesting he knows what's in the document is a fabrication, because no member of Parliament has seen those documents, not because they're not allowed to, but because they didn't ask to see them. Those documents have been given to the law clerk, who has given them directly to the RCMP. So Mr. Scheer is just making things up. There's almost 29,000 pages worth of documents that have been given to the law clerk of the House of Commons that have been passed on to the RCMP. And, there are some redactions, but they're minimal, and they're to protect the privacy rights of Canadians and solicitor-client privilege. And, the fact that he would even suggest he has an idea of what's in them, to me, is ridiculous, because he hasn't seen them, he doesn't know. And the fact of the matter is that we provided as much information as possible to, that is required of us, but protected the part that protects the rights of Canadians, as a government is obliged to do, and protects police independence and the separation of powers in our country. So Mr. Scheer is making things up, and he's fabricating what he's saying.
Now, you say that the redactions are minimal, but it does allow him to say that there's a lack of transparency. So if, for example, this went to committee, would those be unredacted documents that could be reviewed by parliamentarians?
Well, Parliament hasn't asked for these documents for their use, and that's part of the problem, Michael, is that this is the first time in Canadian history that parliamentarians are asking for documents not for their use, but to be given straight to a police force, and in this case, the RCMP. That's what's so unprecedented, and that's what's so concerning about this. So as a government, we have an obligation to protect the rights of Canadians. We have an obligation to respect the independence of the police. The police have said that if they were to use any of these documents, it might compromise their investigation, because it's not the proper proper way to go about getting documents that could have information that could lead to a criminal investigation. And so obviously, if the RCMP were to ask the government for documents, they would do so in a way that follows proper judicial due process, and the government would comply, just as we did when the Auditor General asked for these documents, and there was complete transparency in that process. What Mr. Scheer is alleging and what he is stating is simply false. It is incorrect, and I think it's really irresponsible of him to do this. And basically, he's just trying to prop up the ridiculous partisan games that the Conservative members of Parliament are playing in the House of Commons, because the documents have been shared. The House of Commons is doing what they asked for with them, which is sharing them with the RCMP. We did that to protect Canadians' rights and to respect the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But the Conservative members of Parliament continue to obstruct, they continue to filibuster, they continue to play games, and they're not doing it based on principle. They're not doing it based on anything that is meaningful right now. They're just doing it to advance their own partisan interests and to muck up the business of the House.
So when the Conservative House Leader says that your government has been unwilling to be transparent at every step of this process, what do you say to that?
That is completely and utterly false. You know, this whole thing arose because the Auditor General was doing an audit of this initiative, and of course the government complies entirely with the Auditor General, who is independent. And by the way, the Auditor General raised issues with the motion that the Conservatives put forward because she said it compromises her independence. The RCMP Commissioner raised those same issues when it comes to police independence, as well as the privacy rights and the charter rights of Canadians. So Mr. Scheer is simply stating things that are incorrect and that are false, and only because they want to muck up the work of the House. They want to hold back the important work that parliamentarians are supposed to be here doing for Canadians, and only for their own partisan interest, not because they want to do anything for Canadians, but only because they're in it for themselves.
Okay, so you know, how long will you let it last then? Because, you know, the Globe and Mail, their editorial board did note that the House has already lost, a fifth of its scheduled sitting days in 2024. More than half of the sitting days will be lost if this goes on until the end of the year. So how long will you let this go on for?
Well, look, privilege trumps all other business in the House of Commons. So, you know, privilege is not something that, you know, the average Canadian is thinking about. But when a member's privilege raises a question of privilege, they can debate this motion until it stops. So what the Conservatives have said is that they are just going to keep debating this motion kind of the whole time. And what they did is not only did they introduce their motion, but they amended it so that they could put up even more speakers, because members of Parliament can only speak to an issue one time, right? So they keep amending it so they can put up more speakers, because all they want to do is delay and stop the work of the House of Commons. We've provided the documents. 29,000 pages, almost 29,000 pages. We've done the right thing. We are standing up for the rights of Canadians. We are protecting democracy, and Conservatives are really just trying to make a mess of things. And, you know, for me, that's not what Canadians send us as parliamentarians to Ottawa to do. They expect that we would stand up for their rights. They expect that we take our jobs seriously. You know, today, Michael, I don't know if you watched Question Period, but the way Conservative members of Parliament acted were completely disgraceful. They made an absolute mockery of this place. And I'm sorry, but if you are asking Canadians for your trust and saying that they should have faith in you to govern this country, what I saw today is not fit for leadership. It was, they're trying to make a circus of this place. They do not respect the rules of this institution. They were pushing back against the Speaker's ruling, and I have never seen Conservative members of Parliament act in such a disgraceful and shameful way as I did today. But this is just par for the course with them under Pierre Poilievre's leadership. They have no respect for our institutions. They have no respect for our democracy. And if they don't respect the House of Commons and they don't respect these institutions, they certainly don't respect Canadians.
Okay, listen, I do want to talk about the Conservative MPs that were expelled from the House today for not withdrawing unparliamentary language. But, you know, you and I have talked before, and you said prorogation is not something that you're willing to pursue. But given the impasse, and this has been 8 weeks of this delay, this standoff, is it time to consider prorogation? Will you?
No, because we believe in getting through the work of the House and the important work of Parliament. It is Conservative members of Parliament who are making a mockery of this place. We are committed to delivering on the important legislation, the important programs, and the important policies for Canadians. You know, we understand that this is a really tough time for a lot of families and a lot of people across Canada, and we want to be able to deliver on the programs and the policies that are going to make a meaningful difference in their lives. Conservative members of Parliament do not want to do that. They are making a mockery of this place, and they are disrespecting Canadians. So I am here, Liberal members of Parliament are here to work for Canadians. We take our job seriously. I cannot say the same for Conservative members of Parliament who are demonstrating just how unserious they are, how disrespectful they are of Parliament, how disrespectful they are of Canadians, and instead of working together as Canadians expect for us to be able to deliver for them in meaningful ways that are going to make their lives better, all they do is, you know, make a complete joke of the House of Commons, and they hold up that important work, and they are not here in the best interests of Canadians. They're only here to serve themselves. Okay,
so 3 Conservative MPs were again kicked out of the House of Commons today for not withdrawing unparliamentary language. But you know, 2 of them were asking about your colleague Randy Boissonnault. Mr. Poilievre accusing him of claiming to be Indigenous in order to secure government contracts meant for the Indigenous community. Why should Mr. Boissonnault remain in cabinet given the concerns being expressed?
Look, we have rules in Parliament about respectful language and how we treat each other. And the whole reason we have those rules is so that we can have respectful debate. And there's a reason why we ask our questions and we debate through the Speaker and not towards each other. Those Conservative members of Parliament didn't follow those rules, and that's why they were kicked out. And quite frankly, you know, we can have heated discussions, we can have heated debate. That's part of Parliament, that's part of our democracy, but we can do so in a way that is respectful of each other and respectful of Canadians. When it comes to Mr. Boissonnault, you know, he has addressed those questions, he has addressed those issues, and that is up to him to continue to discuss, because that is about him.
Minister Gould, thank you for the time this evening.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Now, we did invite Mr. Scheer to join our program this evening. That invitation remains open. Well, let's get back to those Conservative MPs who were kicked out of the House of Commons today, each refusing to withdraw unparliamentary language. MP Rick Perkins, who made a comment about Stephen Guilbeault, and MPs Michael Barrett and Michelle Rempel-Gardner, who over the last 2 days made comments about Randy Boissonnault.
When will the Prime Minister come clean? Send the uncensored documents to the RCMP, and including everything that this corrupt environment minister is involved in.
Yeah. That fraudulent minister must resign, or the Prime Minister must fire him.
The Ukrainian president says his country will never give in to Russian aggression, making that statement today before the European Parliament to mark 1,000 days since Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine began.
Putin is focused on winning this war. He will not stop on his own. The more time he has, the worse the conditions become.
Zelensky's warning about Russia came on the same day the Kremlin lowered its threshold for deploying Russia's nuclear arms, allowing them to be used in response to a conventional weapons attack. A clear response to Washington and the U.S. President Joe Biden, who days ago gave Ukraine permission to use American missiles on targets inside Russia. So, what will this mean for the war? What does this mean for countries allied with Ukraine? For some insight, we're now reaching out to security analyst Christian Leuprecht, professor at the Royal Military College and also at Queen's University. Christian, thank you for joining us again.
My pleasure, Michael.
Listen, as we begin our discussion, we should note that there are reports that say Ukraine did use the American missiles today for the first time, hitting an ammunition depot in Russia. Given what we've heard from the Kremlin about lowering its threshold, how worried should we be of a Russian response, the kind of Russian response that we might see?
So there's 2 things going on. One is a signaling effect between the United States and Russia in terms of their deterrence in trying to contain the other side. The other is a psychological effect. Russia has been very effective at deterring Western countries from providing weapons and then giving Ukraine full latitude to use these weapons with nuclear sabering. And so that's part of what's at work here. But more in the minutiae, I think what Russia is signaling is it will not accept a possible another attack by Ukraine on sovereign Russian territory. And so it is trying to limit how the Ukrainians are allowed to use those weapons, even though now President Biden has given the authorization to use the Army tactical missile system. But effectively, this is a defensive measure by the United States. I think there's worry based on the precedent in the spring in the Kharkiv region, where the U.S. already provided some latitude for the Ukrainians to use the HIMARS, the much shorter missile system, into Russia to stabilize the Ukrainian lines there. I think there's a concern that the Ukrainian lines in the Kursk Oblast, that the part of the territory that Ukraine holds, might not hold. And so the Army tactical missile system is effectively a measure to shore up the Ukrainian ability to defend itself against mass troop concentrations and equipment that might support a Russian counteroffensive.
Yeah, and to help people understand that, there's a map up right now that shows Kursk, because that is the territory in Russia that Ukraine is now holding, and as you say, seems to be that's what this ATACMS system will be used for. But if there is a response from Russia, is there a fear that it would be nuclear at this point?
So there is no good reason why the Russian regime would use nuclear weapons. So there's two types of nuclear weapons we need to distinguish between. One is tactical nuclear weapons. So these are short-range weapons you would use on a battlefield to obliterate parts of the other side. They have a limited radius, but essentially you're contaminating that area for the foreseeable future and make it unusable. And of course, Russia's trying to win back land that presumably it wants to use. So why contaminate your own neighborhood? The other is strategic nuclear weapons, intercontinental ballistic missiles and the like, that Russia might use to strike Western capitals, North America, and so forth. This is sort of the extended nuclear deterrence piece. And that would effectively end the Russian regime, because if Russia would launch strategic nuclear weapons, the United States and the mutual assured destruction would launch it as well, and that would be the end of the world sort of as we know it. So in that sense, there's no good rationale, and this is why I think the West has been, especially countries such as Germany, far too constrained as a result of the nuclear saber rattling coming out of Moscow. But as I say, it's been hugely effective for the Putin regime. Yeah,
effective in terms of deterring, but as you say, not a lot of positives to actually go to the nuclear option. So if not a nuclear attack, are we at the very minimum at risk of a conventional weapons attack on other European countries?
Yeah, so it doesn't look like Russia currently has the capacity to really expand the fight that it's in. But what Russia may well do, like it has already done with the Iskander missiles, it might move more lethal weapon systems closer to NATO's borders. And look, the question that you're asking is not unfounded. Donald Tusk of Poland currently has an initiative underway essentially to rally European countries and Canada in the event that there would be a drawdown of U.S. support under Trump's administration, military, materiel, and financial support, to have European countries and Canada keep Ukraine in this fight. And that's clearly because Poland is concerned about either having a Ukrainian collapse and ending up with Russia on its border, or of Russia possibly expanding the fight into the neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. Expanding the fight potentially. And you do raise the issue of Donald Trump, but I think for people who haven't been following the story, there's a big question mark as to how Donald Trump will proceed as to whether or not the United States will continue to be a backer of Ukraine, as we've seen under the Biden administration. So between now and when Donald Trump is inaugurated, and that's not until January 20, Christian, what does Zelensky need to achieve between now and then to ensure Ukrainian victory?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And that depends, of course, of what you understand by victory. But I think what's going to happen in the next 8 weeks or so is that both sides are going to jockey for maximum advantage in case there is a ceasefire or some sort of negotiation. And for the Ukrainians, that will mean holding the lines that they currently have, including the Kursk salient that they've occupied as a bargaining chip with Russia. From the Russian side, that means going all in on trying to win back as much of that salient as possible and trying to make as much in terms of territorial gains as Russia possibly can. And we can see that Russia's already doing that because they're losing 1,500 people a day to death and to injury, and the number is growing, and Russia is throwing equipment that is really not particularly suitable into this fight. And that's why the Army Tactical Missile System is so important, because with Ukrainian drones going into sovereign Russian territory, you get about 1/20th of the punch that you get with one missile. And so these missiles will be hugely important in helping Zelensky achieve the objectives of stabilizing his lines and being able to defend the territory that Ukraine holds within its own country and possibly within the Kursk salient.
Mm-hmm. Do you think they will be forced at the negotiating table? Because Donald Trump is promising to end this war on day one.
So what we do know about Donald Trump, as with any U.S. president for that matter, it will always be America first, and it will always be U.S. unilateralism. What we get with Trump is unilateralism with a frown. That is to say, the best precedent I think we have in this regard is how Trump was trying to deal with North Korea, which is bilaterally, and how Trump dealt ultimately with the Taliban and how he negotiated the drawdown for American and allied troops in Afghanistan. And we know how that went when Trump went it alone. And so that should be a cautionary tale about letting Trump essentially work out some bilateral solution with Putin that might be in the best interests of America, or at least the Trump administration perceives to be in its own best interests, but might have very deleterious consequences for Ukraine, as well as for our allies and partners, including Canada, and possibly sort of stability of Europe more broadly. And so, look, this is the lesson of we don't want to leave international security up to the Americans, because it might turn out in ways that we really didn't want.
Christian, always appreciate the insight. Thank you for this.
It's been my pleasure, Michael. Thank you.
And thank you, Christian Leuprecht. Well, back here at home, we're just 1 week away from Election Day in Nova Scotia. Not that everyone is waiting until next Tuesday to vote. And that includes the Nova Scotia NDP leader, Claudia Chender, who cast her ballot this morning in her riding of Dartmouth South. Well, to talk about the Nova Scotia election and other matters, we're now joined by polls analyst Éric Grenier, the man behind the writ. Éric, always good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Happy to be here.
So let's begin with Nova Scotia, because as we talk about the province, I think it's worthwhile to look at the bigger picture here, because when you look at the numbers, it looks like Tim Houston and his PC party are enjoying a very comfortable lead at this point.
Yeah, every poll that we've seen in the run-up to the campaign and over the last few weeks has given Tim Houston and the PCs a big lead in the polls, usually somewhere around 47 to 50% of the vote. The Liberals are usually trailing with around 20 to 25, and the NDP somewhere around 23 to 25% of the vote. And with that kind of big lead where the PCs are more or less doubling up on either the Liberals or the NDP, they are in a very big position to win a very big majority government, anywhere between 38 and 45 seats, something like that. And the real contest might actually be for who's going to be in the official opposition position, because while that was the Liberals going into this campaign, the fact that they have lost so much support since the last election does actually put their position as the second place party in the province at risk. The NDP might actually be in a better spot to finish second in terms of the seats.
Okay, why is that? When you look at the Liberals and the NDP in the province, why the flip?
Well, it's been because the Liberal vote has dropped in both Halifax and outside of Halifax. And the issue for the NDP is that their vote in the capital has actually held up pretty good. In a lot of the polls that we've seen in the Halifax regional municipality, the NDP is not too far behind the PCs. And if we're just looking at the urban core of Halifax, the NDP is actually quite competitive. So the NDP, with about the same level of support as the Liberals, could be able to win 6, 7, 8, maybe even 10 seats. But the Liberal support, they're usually in second place in the mainland of Nova Scotia on Cape Breton Island, but they're so far behind the PCs that they might just run up a lot of second place finishes and not turn the same amount of votes that the NDP has across the province into anywhere near as many seats. So the PCs are still in a good position to win lots of seats in the suburbs of Halifax, but more or less run the table on Cape Breton Island and in the rural mainland.
Okay, so a race for official opposition, but let's get back to Tim Houston and the PCs here, because they're an incumbent party, and when you look at the past few elections, incumbent parties have been punished for tough economic times and high inflation of recent years. Why haven't those been issues for Tim Houston?
I think one of the things that's working in his favor is that he is a recent incumbent. He was only elected in 2021. This election is actually happening about 8 months ahead of schedule. So he has only been in power for 3 years. And I think he was actually riding the first wave of anti-incumbency, because he came in with the PCs in 2021. It was an upset victory against what was then the Liberal government. And so I don't think they have the baggage that we see some of those other incumbents, like the NDP that went in 2017 in British Columbia, or the Sask Party, or the New Brunswick PCs that were first elected in 2018. So I think that Tim Houston and the PC still have a little bit of a new car smell, if you could call it that, for a government. And we've seen that the polling does suggest that Nova Scotians still trust the PCs on those big issues, healthcare and on the economy, on affordability. They trust the PCs over the opposition parties. So while a lot of other incumbents are struggling, the PCs, I don't think, are still tarred with the brush of having been in power for too long and being to blame for the problems that are plaguing the province.
Okay, so we will know the final results 1 week from now. We'll keep following that story. But listen, let's switch over to the federal scene right now, because while I have you, I think it's worthwhile to talk about the by-election that's coming up in the BC Lower Mainland, scheduled for December the 16th. It's in the riding of Cloverdale-Langley City, a Liberal seat from 2015 to 2019, again a Liberal seat in 2021. What are you looking for in this by-election?
Well, it'll really just see what the margin is. The Liberals won the seat by 3 points in the last election, and was, as you mentioned, a swing seat, went back and forth between the Liberals and the Conservatives over the last few elections. Based on what we've seen in the by-elections in Toronto St. Paul's and La Salle-Mont-Verdun, a 3-point margin is not something that the Liberals can take for granted. We've seen the swing in the polls in British Columbia has been enormous. The Conservatives are up about 12 points since the last election. The Liberals are down about 9 points. That's a total swing of roughly 20 points. It was only a 3-point margin. So I think it will be to see if the Liberals, it's not really if the Liberals can hold it. I really don't think that they can. It's how much of a margin the Conservatives are going to be building up, because Cloverdale-Langley City would be very, very early on in the target list for Conservatives. So they need to not only win this, they need to win it by a big margin to signal that they're going to win other ridings that are a lot tougher than this one. So I think just the scale of the Conservative victory, if to already make a prediction like that always makes me uncomfortable. But just to see how big it would be, I think is what I'll be watching in that by-election night. Okay.
Yeah, and I agree with you about uncomfortable predictions. But if it does go Conservative, how troubling would that be for the Prime Minister? Because there's also been this Nanos poll this week that says the majority of Canadians think it's time for Justin Trudeau to step down.
I think that a loss here is almost inevitable, and it's expected that it won't be as damaging to the Liberals as the defeat in Toronto and in Montreal. Both of those were stronghold ridings that have traditionally been very strong for the party. This is a riding that, even in a decent election for the Liberals, they'd have a hard time holding on to it. So I don't think it'll be as damaging, but you're starting to pile up those defeats. Toronto, Montreal, the Greater Vancouver area, and if there's another by-election that comes early next year in Halifax, in Atlantic Canada, that is pretty much the Liberal base. And so this will just be another knock against the party and another knock against what their chances of winning the next election, because this is the kind of seat that puts them in government. It's not the kind of seat that puts them in disaster mode like in Toronto or in Montreal. But a loss is a loss, even if it is an expected one.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we will talk again ahead of that by-election. Éric, always good to have you in the program. Thank you for this.
All right. Thank you.
And that is Primetime Politics for this Tuesday. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. We're back again tomorrow evening. Until then, take care.